James Calloway had spent most of his life chasing justice. As a former FBI director, he was no stranger to high-pressure situations, dangerous criminals, or the weight of responsibility that came with his badge. But now, in his retirement, he wanted nothing more than peace. Quiet mornings, warm coffee, and maybe a chance to enjoy life without constantly looking over his shoulder. That's why he decided to move to Pine Hollow, a small southern town surrounded by dense forests and sprawling fields. It seemed like the perfect place to start fresh. Pine Hollow wasn't flashy or glamorous. It was quiet, almost sleepy. The streets were lined with charming old buildings, and everyone seemed to know each other. At first glance, it felt like the kind of place where time stood still. James rented a cozy little house on the edge of town, far enough from the main hustle, but close enough to feel connected. He quickly settled into a routine. Morning walks through the park, afternoons reading books on his porch, and evenings grabbing dinner at the local diner, which served some of the best fried chicken he'd ever tasted. The diner became his favorite spot. It was always lively, filled with chatter and laughter, and the staff treated him kindly. They didn't pry too much about who he was or what he'd done before moving there. To them, he was just another friendly face, a retired man enjoying the simple pleasures of life. But one evening, everything changed. It started innocently enough. James sat at his usual booth near the window, sipping a cup of black coffee while flipping through the pages of an old newspaper. Across the room, a group of young women sat laughing loudly, their voices carrying over the hum of conversation. One of them caught his eye, not because she was particularly striking, but because something about her demeanor felt off. She had sharp features, piercing eyes, and an air of arrogance that made her stand out in the otherwise laid-back atmosphere. Her name was Lila Harper, though James didn't know that yet. What he did notice was how she carried herself, confident, to the point of arrogance, and how she occasionally shot glares around the room as if daring anyone to challenge her. When their eyes met briefly, James felt a flicker of unease. There was something unsettling about her gaze, like she could see right through him and didn't care for what she found. As the night wore on, James finished his meal and prepared to leave. Just as he stood up, Lila approached him. Her steps were deliberate, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. For a moment, James thought she might simply walk past him, but instead, she stopped directly in front of him, blocking his path. "You're him, aren't you?" she said, her tone icy. Caught off guard, James hesitated. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" "You don't need to pretend," she snapped, her voice rising slightly. "I've seen your face on TV. You're that
ex-FBI guy, the one who thinks he knows everything about policing." James frowned, trying to keep his composure. "If you're referring to interviews I gave about reforming law enforcement, then yes, that would be me."
"Is there something I can help you with?" Lila sneered. "Help me? No, you've already done enough damage. You think running your mouth makes you a hero? My dad works his butt off keeping this town safe, and people like you trash him in public." Ah, so that explained it. James realized now that this must be the daughter of someone in law enforcement, someone who likely resented his critiques of systemic issues within police departments. He'd faced backlash before, of course, but never quite so personally. Still, he remained calm. "I'm not here to attack anyone," he said evenly. "My goal has always been to improve things for everyone involved, including officers like your father." But Lila wasn't interested in hearing reason. If anything, his measured response only fueled her anger. "Don't give me that garbage," she spat. "You come here acting all high and mighty, stirring up trouble in places where you don't belong. This is our town, not yours." By now, several patrons had turned their attention to the unfolding scene. Some looked uncomfortable, while others appeared intrigued. James glanced around, aware that the situation was escalating faster than he'd anticipated. He didn't want to cause a scene, especially not in such a tight-knit community. "Look," he said, lowering his voice, "I understand you're upset, but let's not make this personal. I'm just trying to live my life peacefully." "Peacefully?" Lila laughed bitterly. "You won't find peace here if you keep pushing your agenda. Maybe it's time you left before things get worse. Her words sent a chill down James's spine. Not because he feared her threats, but because they hinted at deeper problems lurking beneath Pine Hollow's surface. This wasn't just about him. It was about power, privilege, and the fragility of those who clung to outdated beliefs. Rather than respond, James nodded politely, stepped around her, and walked out of the diner without another word. As he drove home that night, James couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was only the beginning. Pine Hollow might have seemed idyllic at first glance, but every town had its secrets, and judging by Lila's venomous attitude, this one was no exception. Little did he know, his decision to stay would set off a chain reaction that would test his resolve, challenge his ideals, and ultimately force him to confront the very forces he'd dedicated his career to fighting against. The next morning, James woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside his window. The sun streamed through the curtains, casting golden light across the room. For a brief moment, he almost forgot about the strange encounter at the diner the night before. Almost. As he sipped his coffee and stared out at the peaceful scenery, snippets of Lila's angry words replayed in his mind. Her accusations, her threats, they lingered like an unwelcome shadow. James tried to shrug it off. He'd faced hostility before during his career, both as an FBI agent and later as a public figure advocating for reform. People didn't always react well to criticism, especially when it came from someone who had once held authority. But something about Lila felt different. It wasn't just her anger or even her arrogance. It was the way she carried herself, as if she believed she was untouchable. That sense of entitlement worried him more than anything else. Later that afternoon, James decided to visit the local library. He loved spending time there, surrounded by books and quiet corners where he could think. Pine Hollow's library was small but charming, with creaky wooden floors and shelves crammed full of novels, history books, and newspapers. Today, however, the usual calm atmosphere seemed disrupted. A few people whispered among themselves, glancing toward James whenever they thought he wasn't looking. At first, he assumed they were merely curious about the newcomer in town, but then he overheard fragments of their conversation. "Did you hear about what happened last night?" one woman murmured to another. "That man, the retired FBI guy, he got into it with Lila Harper." James froze mid-step, pretending to examine a book on the shelf while straining to catch more details. The second woman nodded knowingly. "Yeah, I heard. Poor guy probably didn't know what he was getting himself into. Lila doesn't take kindly to anyone criticizing her dad." So, the news had spread already. James sighed inwardly. Small towns thrived on gossip, and it seemed his run-in with Lila was now front-page material, at least in the unofficial sense. He couldn't blame them for talking. After all, drama like this didn't happen often in a place as quiet as Pine Hollow. Still, it made him uneasy. He hadn't come here looking for trouble, but trouble seemed determined to find him. As he browsed the shelves, trying to focus on finding a good read, James noticed a young woman sitting at a nearby table. She looked to be in her late 20s, with curly brown hair and glasses perched on her nose. She was typing furiously on her laptop, occasionally pausing to scribble notes in a notebook beside her. Something about her caught his attention. Perhaps it was the intensity of her concentration or the stack of folders labeled Sheriff's Department Records sitting next to her. Curiosity got the better of him. He approached her cautiously, clearing his throat to get her attention. "Excuse me," he said politely. "I couldn't help noticing your materials. Are you researching something related to law enforcement?" The woman glanced up, startled, then relaxed slightly when she saw his friendly expression. "Oh, hi," she replied. "Yes, actually. I'm Clara Bennett. I write for the Pine Hollow Gazette. I've been doing some digging into, well, let's just say certain practices within our local sheriff's department." James raised an eyebrow. "Certain practices? Care to elaborate?" Clara hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether or not to trust him. Finally, she gestured for him to sit down. "It's complicated," she admitted. "There have been rumors for years about misconduct, racial profiling, excessive force, favoritism, but nothing concrete enough to hold anyone accountable. Until recently, most people were too scared to speak out. Her words struck a chord with James. He leaned forward, intrigued. And now? Now, Clara continued, lowering her voice. Things are changing. More people are willing to talk. Some anonymous tips have surfaced, pointing to patterns of behavior that can't be ignored. But it's risky. Anyone who speaks up risks retaliation, not just from the deputies but also from their families and friends. This town is tight-knit, and loyalty runs deep. James nodded slowly, connecting the dots. If Lila's father worked for the sheriff's office, it made sense that she would defend him so fiercely. And if the department really did have skeletons in its closet, it explained why she reacted so strongly to James's presence. Perhaps she saw him as a threat, a potential catalyst for exposing truths best left buried. Over the next hour, James and Clara talked extensively. She shared stories of residents who claimed they'd been unfairly targeted by deputies, including one elderly black man who was pulled over repeatedly without cause. Another story involved a Latino teenager who was detained overnight based on flimsy evidence. Each anecdote painted a troubling picture of systemic bias and unchecked power. By the end of their conversation, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. He hadn't planned to dive back into activism so soon after retiring, but how could he ignore what was happening right under his nose? Pine Hollow might have seemed idyllic on the surface, but beneath its picturesque facade lay cracks threatening to split it apart. That evening, as James walked home, he found himself replaying everything Clara had told him. His thoughts kept returning to Lila. Was she truly as ruthless as she appeared, or was she simply protecting her family? Either way, her actions, and those of others like her, were symptomatic of a larger issue. Change wouldn't come easily, especially in a community resistant to outsiders questioning their way of life. But James knew one thing for certain: staying silent wasn't an option. When he reached his house, James sat on the porch steps, staring out at the darkening sky. The stars began to twinkle faintly, reminding him of nights spent reflecting during his FBI days. Back then, every case had presented a puzzle to solve, a wrong to right. Now, it seemed fate had handed him another challenge, one rooted not in crime scenes or criminals, but in the hearts and minds of ordinary people. For the first time since moving to Pine Hollow, James felt a spark of excitement mixed with trepidation. Whatever lay ahead, he knew it wouldn't be easy. Yet, as daunting as the road might be, he couldn't walk away, not when justice hung in the balance. By the third day after his encounter with Lila, James noticed a shift in the air. Pine Hollow, once a quiet and seemingly uneventful town, now buzzed with tension. The whispers that had started at the library had spread like wildfire, reaching every corner of the community. People talked about him, James Calloway, the retired FBI director who dared to challenge the status quo. Some admired his courage, while others viewed him as an outsider stirring up trouble. James felt the weight of these opinions pressing down on him. It wasn't just idle gossip anymore. It was affecting how people treated him. At the grocery store, cashiers avoided making eye contact. Neighbors who used to wave hello now hurried past him, pretending not to notice. Even the diner, which had become his sanctuary, no longer felt welcoming. When he walked in for breakfast one morning, the chatter stopped abruptly, and several patrons turned their heads to stare. James forced a smile, nodded politely, and took his usual seat, but the unease lingered. Then came the threats. They started subtly. A note slipped under his door late at night, written in block letters. "Leave this town or face the consequences." James read it twice, then crumpled it up and tossed it into the trash. He wasn't easily intimidated, but the message sent a clear warning. Someone wanted him gone. The next day, another note appeared, this time taped to his car windshield. "We warned you," it said simply. By the end of the week, his mailbox contained yet another unsigned letter, this one more menacing. "You're playing with fire." Despite the growing hostility, James refused to back down. Instead, he saw the threats as confirmation that he was onto something important. If people were willing to resort to intimidation, it meant they were afraid, and fear often stemmed from guilt. James decided to dig deeper, determined to uncover the truth behind the rumors Clara had shared with him. He began by revisiting the stories she'd told him, piecing together patterns and inconsistencies. One name kept coming up: Deputy Robert Harper, Lila's father. According to the accounts, Harper was known for his aggressive tactics and inflammatory remarks. Residents described him as a man who ruled through fear rather than respect, someone who believed in maintaining order at any cost. James wondered if Harper's behavior was merely the result of personal prejudice, or if it reflected broader issues within the sheriff's department. To gather more information, James reached out to some of the individuals Clara had mentioned. His first visit was to Mr. Thompson, the elderly black man who claimed he'd been pulled over repeatedly without cause. Mr. Thompson lived in a modest home on the outskirts of town, surrounded by flower beds and vegetable patches. When James knocked on the door, the older man greeted him warmly, though there was a hint of caution in his eyes. "Come on in," Mr. Thompson said, ushering James inside. "Can I get you some tea?" James accepted gratefully and sat down at the kitchen table. After exchanging pleasantries, he broached the subject carefully. "Mr. Thompson, I understand you've had some difficulties with the sheriff's department. Would you mind sharing your experience with me?" The older man sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. "It's been going on for years," he confessed. "Every other week it seems I get pulled over. Sometimes they say my tail light is out, sometimes it's because I didn't signal long enough. But I know what it is, it's because of my skin color. And don't think I haven't tried speaking up, nobody listens." James listened intently, jotting down notes. He asked follow-up questions, encouraging Mr. Thompson to elaborate on specific incidents. The more he heard, the angrier he became, not at Mr. Thompson, but at the system that allowed such injustices to persist unchecked. Before leaving, James thanked the older man for his honesty and promised to do everything in his power to bring attention to the issue. Over the next few days, James met with others who had similar stories to tell. There was Maria Alvarez, a young mother whose son had been detained overnight after being accused of vandalism despite having an alibi. Then there was Jamal Carter, a college student who was frisked and questioned outside a convenience store simply because he fit the description. Each story added another layer to the troubling picture emerging before James's eyes. Word of his efforts quickly spread, drawing both support and backlash. Some residents praised him for shining a light on long-ignored problems, while others accused him of exaggerating or fabricating claims to stir up drama. Among the latter group was Lila Harper, who seemed to take particular offense to James's actions. She began showing up wherever he went, at the grocery store, the park, even the gas station, always lurking nearby, watching him with narrowed eyes. One afternoon, as James left the post office, Lila confronted him again. This time, she wasn't alone. Two men stood beside her, their arms crossed and expressions stony. James recognized them immediately, deputies from the sheriff's department. Though neither wore uniforms, their badges were visible on their belts. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Lila sneered, stepping forward. Her tone was sharp, dripping with disdain. "People around here are tired of your meddling. You think you can waltz in and start accusing good officers of wrongdoing? Who do you think you are?" James remained calm, meeting her gaze steadily. "I'm someone who believes in fairness and accountability," he replied evenly. "If the department has nothing to hide, then why does everyone seem so eager to silence me?" Lila's face flushed red with anger. "Don't twist this around," she snapped. "This isn't about fairness. It's about respect. You're disrespecting our town, our families, and our way of life. If you know what's good for you, you'll pack your bags and leave before things escalate further." The two deputies shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. Neither intervened, but their presence spoke volumes. James understood the message loud and clear. Back off or face the consequences. Yet instead of feeling intimidated, James felt emboldened. These weren't just empty threats, they were admissions of guilt. If the department truly had nothing to hide, They wouldn't need to rely on intimidation tactics to protect their reputation. As James walked away, Lila called after him, her voice laced with venom. "Mark my words, Mr. Calloway, you'll regret this." Despite her warning, James pressed on. He began documenting everything: the anonymous notes, the hostile encounters, the testimonies of those affected by the department's actions. With Clara's help, he compiled a detailed report, complete with names, dates, and evidence. Together, they strategized about how best to present their findings to the public. They knew it wouldn't be easy. Pine Hollow was resistant to change, but they also knew the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. That night, as James reviewed the materials spread across his dining table, he felt a mix of emotions. Frustration, yes, but also hope. For all its flaws, Pine Hollow was still a community capable of growth and transformation. All it needed was a push, a spark to ignite the flame of progress. And James was ready to be that spark, no matter the cost. James knew he was stepping into dangerous territory. Every piece of evidence he gathered, every story he documented, brought him closer to the truth, but also deeper into the crosshairs of those who wanted to keep that truth buried. The weight of what he was doing wasn't lost on him. He wasn't just challenging one deputy or even one department. He was confronting an entire system built on privilege, fear, and silence. Yet, despite the risks, James couldn't turn away. This wasn't just about Pine Hollow anymore. It was about justice, for Mr. Thompson, for Maria Alvarez, for Jamal Carter, and for countless others whose voices had been ignored. The investigation consumed him. Days turned into nights as James pored over files, interviewed more residents, and pieced together patterns of misconduct. Clara became his unofficial partner in this endeavor, her journalistic instincts sharpening their efforts. Together they uncovered a disturbing trend. Minorities in Pine Hollow were disproportionately targeted by law enforcement. Traffic stops, arrests, and detentions often lacked sufficient cause, yet no complaints ever led to disciplinary action against the deputies involved. Worse still, internal investigations conducted by the sheriff's office routinely cleared officers of wrongdoing, regardless of the evidence presented. One evening, while reviewing case files at Clara's apartment, James stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. Buried within a stack of old incident reports was a memo authored by none other than Deputy Robert Harper himself. The document outlined strategies for maintaining order in neighborhoods with high minority populations. Among the suggestions, increased patrols, aggressive questioning, and preemptive arrests to prevent trouble before it starts. Though Harper never explicitly mentioned race, the implications were clear. His approach wasn't about safety, it was about control. "This is it," James said, holding up the memo triumphantly. "This is proof." Clara leaned over to examine the document, her eyes widening. "It's damning," she agreed, "but we need to be careful how we use it. If we go public too soon, they'll try to discredit us or worse, destroy the evidence." James nodded grimly. She was right. They had to tread carefully. Pine Hollow's power structure wouldn't crumble easily, especially not without a fight. But they also couldn't afford to wait much longer. With each passing day, the threats against James grew bolder. Anonymous phone calls began late at night, low voices whispering menacing warnings. Someone slashed his car tires. A rock shattered his living room window, accompanied by another note. Last chance. Determined not to let fear dictate his actions, James pressed forward. He reached out to former colleagues in the FBI, seeking advice on navigating such a volatile situation. One friend, a retired agent named Marcus, offered invaluable guidance. "You're walking a tightrope here, James," Marcus warned during a phone call. "These people aren't going to back down quietly. You need allies, people who can amplify your message and protect you if things get ugly." Taking Marcus's advice to heart, James expanded his network. He contacted civil rights organizations, sharing preliminary findings and asking for support. To his relief, several groups expressed interest, promising to send representatives to Pine Hollow once. The investigation gained momentum. Meanwhile, Clara worked tirelessly to draft articles exposing the sheriff's department's practices. Her first piece, titled "Justice Denied: The Untold Stories of Pine Hollow Residents," ran in the Pine Hollow Gazette, sparking heated discussions across town. Not everyone welcomed the attention. Some residents accused Clara of sensationalism, claiming her reporting was biased and divisive. Others rallied behind her, praising her bravery for tackling such a contentious issue. Tensions escalated further when Lila Harper publicly denounced both James and Clara during a community meeting. Standing beside her father, she railed against outsiders trying to tear apart our town and demanded accountability from anyone spreading lies about the sheriff's department. Her performance earned applause from some attendees but left others visibly uncomfortable. Among them was Sarah Dawson, a longtime resident and schoolteacher who approached James after the meeting. "I've lived here my whole life," she confessed quietly, "and I've seen enough to know there's truth in what you're saying. But speaking up, it's risky. People lose jobs, friendships, even their homes if they cross the wrong people." James thanked her for her honesty and urged her to consider joining their cause. "Change won't happen unless people like you stand up," he told her gently. "We can't do this alone." Sarah hesitated but eventually nodded. Over the following days, she introduced James and Clara to other sympathetic residents willing to share their experiences. Their testimonies added depth and credibility to the growing dossier of evidence. Slowly but surely, the walls surrounding Pine Hollow's secrets began to crack. Still, resistance remained fierce. Deputies started patrolling James's neighborhood. More frequently, their presence unmistakably intended as intimidation. Lila herself seemed omnipresent, showing up wherever James went, her glare unwavering. At one point, she cornered him outside the library, accusing him of manipulating vulnerable residents for personal gain. "You think you're some kind of savior?" she spat. "You're nothing but a troublemaker." James met her accusations with calm resolve. "If wanting fairness makes me a troublemaker, then so be it," he replied. "But don't mistake my intentions. I'm not here for revenge or glory. I'm here because what's happening in this town is wrong and someone needs to say it." Lila scoffed but didn't respond. Instead, she stormed off, muttering under her breath. Watching her retreat, James felt a flicker of pity. For all her bluster, she was clearly terrified. Terrified of losing the world she believed she controlled. Perhaps, he thought, that fear could become a turning point. After all, change often came when people realized they had no choice but to adapt. As the days passed, James and Clara finalized their report, compiling years' worth of data, testimonials, and documents into a comprehensive exposé. They titled it, "Shadows of Justice: Uncovering Systemic Bias in Pine Hollow." The document was thorough, compelling, and impossible to ignore. All that remained was deciding how best to release it. "We should hold a press conference," Clara suggested. "Invite reporters from bigger outlets, not just local papers. We need national attention if we want real change," James agreed. A press conference would put Pine Hollow in the spotlight, forcing authorities to address the allegations head-on. But it also meant escalating the stakes. Once the story broke, there would be no turning back. The town, and its leaders, would have to choose sides. On the morning of the scheduled event, James stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his tie. His hands trembled slightly, but his expression was resolute. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he couldn't walk away, not now, not when so many lives depended on him staying the course. As he stepped outside, ready to face whatever came next, James reminded himself why he'd started this journey in the first place. Justice wasn't just a word. It was a promise. And in Pine Hollow, that promise was long overdue. The day of the press conference arrived, and Pine Hollow buzzed with anticipation. Word had spread quickly about James Calloway's plans to expose alleged misconduct within the sheriff's department. Residents gathered in clusters around town, debating what this might mean for their community. Some expressed cautious optimism, hoping that answers would finally come to light. Others bristled at the thought of outsiders judging their way of life, vowing to defend the status quo no matter the cost. James and Clara chose the town hall as the venue for the event. a symbolic decision meant to underscore the importance of transparency and accountability. The building itself was modest but historic, its weathered brick walls bearing witness to decades of civic discussions. By mid-morning, a crowd had formed outside, spilling onto the lawn. Reporters from local newspapers mingled with representatives from national outlets, microphones and cameras at the ready. It was clear that James and Clara's efforts had struck a nerve far beyond Pine Hollow's borders. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Rows of chairs filled rapidly, with attendees ranging from concerned citizens to curious onlookers. At the front of the room stood a podium, flanked by two large screens which would display key documents and testimonies during the presentation. James sat quietly off to the side, reviewing his notes one last time while Clara double-checked the technical setup. Both were acutely aware of the stakes. This moment could either galvanize support for reform or ignite a backlash that would make their work even harder. As the clock struck noon, Clara stepped up to the podium to introduce the proceedings. Her voice rang out confidently, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today," she began. "What we're about to share is not just a story, it's a call to action. For too long, the residents of Pine Hollow have lived under a system riddled with inequality and injustice. Today, we aim to shine a light on those shadows." With that, she handed the floor to James. As he approached the podium, the room fell, silent. All eyes were on him, some filled with hope, others with skepticism. James took a deep breath, steadying himself before beginning. "When I moved to Pine Hollow," he said, "I came seeking peace, a chance to step away from the battles I'd fought throughout my career. But sometimes destiny has other plans. What I've discovered here isn't unique to this town. It's a reflection of systemic issues that plague communities across the country. Bias, fear, and unchecked power thrive when silence prevails, and silence is no longer an option." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. Over the next hour, James walked the audience through the evidence they had gathered. He displayed internal memos authored by Deputy Robert Harper, highlighting language that encouraged aggressive policing tactics in minority neighborhoods. He shared testimonials from residents like Mr. Thompson, Maria Alvarez, and Jamal Carter, whose lives had been disrupted by discriminatory practices. Each story painted a vivid picture of a broken system, one that prioritized control over compassion. The impact of the presentation was immediate. Gasps rippled through the crowd as shocking details emerged. On the screens, graphs illustrated stark disparities in arrest rates between white residents and minorities. Incident reports revealed patterns of misconduct that had gone unaddressed for years. Even some skeptics found themselves nodding along, unable to deny the weight of the evidence. But not everyone reacted positively. Amid the sea of faces, Lila Harper sat near the back of the room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Beside her, her father, Deputy Harper, glowered at the podium, his jaw clenched. When James mentioned Harper's name specifically, linking him to several questionable incidents, Lila shot to her feet. "This is slander," she shouted, pointing an accusatory finger at James. "You're attacking good people because you hate law enforcement." Her outburst drew murmurs of disapproval from parts of the audience, but she pressed on, undeterred. "My dad works hard every single day to keep this town safe. People like you don't care about us, you only want to tear everything apart." James remained calm, meeting her fiery gaze with steady composure. "Miss Harper," he replied evenly, "if your father has done nothing wrong, then he has nothing to fear from an honest investigation. What I'm asking for isn't punishment, it's accountability. Isn't that what we all deserve?" Lila flushed red, fumbling for a retort, but before she could respond, the mayor of Pine Hollow rose from his seat. A tall, gray-haired man, named Walter Grayson, the mayor had always prided himself on maintaining harmony in the town. Now, however, his expression was troubled. Stepping forward, he addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what we're hearing today is deeply concerning. While I respect Mr. Calloway's intentions, I must emphasize that accusations of this magnitude require careful consideration. We cannot rush to judgment without proper due process. His words seemed calculated to placate both sides, but they did little to quell the growing tension. Supporters of James and Clara applauded loudly, urging the mayor to take action. Opponents muttered angrily, accusing James of using fear-mongering tactics to divide the community. The room teetered on the edge of chaos until Clara intervened, stepping back to the podium. "Mayor Grayson is correct," she said firmly. "Due process is essential. That's why we're calling for an independent investigation into these allegations. Not by the sheriff's office, not by anyone tied to the current system, but by unbiased experts who can ensure fairness." Her proposal earned nods of approval from many in the audience, but it also drew sharp criticism from others. Lila, still seething, stormed out of the room, followed closely by her father. Their dramatic exit sent another ripple through the crowd, underscoring just how polarizing the issue had become. By the end of the press conference, emotions ran high. Journalists swarmed James and Clara, peppering them with questions about next steps and potential outcomes. Outside, protesters gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "End racial profiling." Across town, counter-protesters chanted slogans supporting the sheriff's department, their voices echoing through the streets. That evening, as James returned home, he felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The day had been grueling, but it had also marked a turning point. Pine Hollow could no longer ignore the problems festering beneath its surface. Whether the town chose to confront those issues or dig in its heels remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: the fight for justice was far from over. As he sat on his porch watching the stars twinkle above, James reflected on the events of the day. He thought about the courage it took for ordinary people to stand up and speak their truth. He thought about the resistance they faced and the sacrifices they might yet endure. And he thought about Lila Harper, not with anger, but with sadness. She wasn't the enemy. She was a product of a flawed system clinging desperately to the only world she knew. For now, the battle lines had been drawn. But James believed in the power of change, the kind that started small, with a single spark, and grew into something unstoppable. In Pine Hollow, that spark had been lit. All that remained was to fan the flames.